Hello, and today's guest on the Keen Yoga podcast. Well, welcome to the Keen Yoga podcast, first of all. And today's guest is Gary Kraftsow. Wanted to speak to Gary for a long, long time. And he's a student, he's a student of mainly Desikachar, TKV Desikachar. And he even met his father, Krishnamacharya, Sri Krishnamacharya, in Madras in, what was it, Gary, 70 something?
1974.
Oh, just incredible. Anyway, thank you for coming on. Lovely to have you.
It's an honor to be here. I'm happy to be here and to share with your community.
Right. Well, I do have some more technical questions. I've read a couple of Gary's books, and one of them, Yoga for Wellness, totally recommended. A very practical guide to the method that he's really promoted over these many years, Viniyoga, which is structured on TKV Desikachar's teaching. But nevertheless, before that, I really want to get into some older stories because Gary has been around. He was just talking pre-show about his contacts with Krishnamacharya and Desikachar, and I'm kind of very keen to know a little bit about your background, Gary, and how you started, and obviously the meeting with your teachers.
Yeah, well, thank you. I like that you're keen on knowing, keen on yoga.
I keep saying
it's very cool. I was a student. I had gone to my first year in undergraduate school. After I finished high school, I went to the university. I went to a university in upstate New York called Colgate University. And I was a student of religion from sort of an intellectual, experiential perspective, not in terms of belonging to a particular tradition, but understanding the teachings from the ancients about the nature of the human experience. And I took a course on Hinduism in the religious studies department, and there was a phys ed requirement, and so I took a class on karate, and it was just funny that it happened that way, and I really loved the Hinduism class, and in fact, I encountered Patanjali. So my first real contact with yoga was Patanjali in this course. So the next semester, I enrolled in the course on Buddhism. And then for the religious studies, for the phys ed requirement, I took a class on yoga. Now, this yoga class was taught by a woman named Mary Louise Skelton, who had been a student of Krishnamacharya for many years, had lived in India with her husband, who was an ethnomusicologist. So I encountered Patanjali in the Hinduism class. And then 6 months later, I took a class in the phys ed department, which was basically an asana practice class, but it was led by a woman who had lived in India and studied with Krishnamacharya. 6 months later, her husband, who was the chairman of the music department, was taking a study group of music students to India to study Carnatic music. And they invited me to come arrange coursework at Madras University. So I then went to Madras University and studied Shaivite Siddhanta, which is a South Indian tantric tradition. But really, I went to meet Krishnamacharya, whom I met, and then, of course, became a student of his son, Desikachar. And that was in 1974. So I met them in 74, and I stayed there for 6 months, came home, finished college a couple of years later. Desikachar came for a study group. That became the text or the book, Religiousness in Yoga. That was from a study group that he led in a January program at Colgate.
And then I graduated. I looked it up on the last podcast that you, sorry to disrupt you. I looked it up because in the last podcast you mentioned that book and I thought, wow, I'm going to get my hands on that book. And I think it's available on Amazon if you're looking, readers, listeners, but I think it's about $100 or it's not cheap, but it is there.
It's oddly expensive, but
yes.
A much later student of Desikachar was a guy named from, I think, New Zealand, Mark Whitwell, who repackaged it as the Heart of Yoga. And the Heart of Yoga has the original text. It's more than that of Religiousness in Yoga as well. But after I graduated Colgate, that was in 1976, I returned to Madras. It was called Madras then, and lived there for 2 years and studied with Desikachar and interacted a little bit with Krishnamacharya. He died in 1987. So I was there from 76 to 70. Early 79. Then I came back and went to graduate school, studied Sanskrit at University of California. And I'm an ABD, all but dissertation. I got the master's and I just got tired of the academic methodology. And I said I quit and went back to India. and stayed another year and a half in 80, 81. And then back and forth to India, over the years until about 2001 or 2002 was the last time. Then I didn't go again until 2012. But I was about 4 years in Madras. It was called Madras when I lived there principally. Now it's Chennai, as I said. And so that's the story. I started, at 19 years old, I encountered yoga and met Krishnamacharya, and here I am. I'm 69, so that's 50 years now since I met them. And my life has been really about the study and practice of yoga and the teaching of yoga and the training of yoga teachers. And I was trained in the early 70s and mid 70s in yoga therapy, which wasn't a thing back then, but it's become a thing. So I've been actively involved with practicing one-on-one yoga therapy and training therapists and doing research. And we've got a couple of National Institute of Health and Aetna insurance company and, and different university grants that we've done on yoga therapy.
I don't really know where to start, to be honest. I mean, it's just incredible to meet someone who, has had access to these two great teachers. I mean, people are I wanted to ask you more technical questions on asana, because the book that I read on yoga, on yoga therapy is incredible, actually. And even from, someone who's ostensibly practiced Ashtanga for many years, some really sensible and reasonable, guidance, for whatever practice you do, whether it be Viniyoga or whatever you're doing, Vinyasa yoga with goats or anything.
It's an extraordinary amount of intelligence in this system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes across. But before that, everyone's going to want to ask the obvious questions, aren't they? What did you get from Krishnamacharya? How is he as a man? And I'm curious also about Desikachar, because you mentioned he was he always comes across as a very pragmatic man, like in the heart of yoga, is very kind of kind, gentle, pragmatic. But you mentioned in a couple of side comments that he was actually quite tough, that in some ways his methods wouldn't be currently tolerated in the modern climate, you said at one point, which I found kind of intriguing. So maybe say something
first about Krishnamacharya. Let's be clear. I met him when I was 19. He was intimidating, to say the least. And he was like from a different time, really. He was an Orthodox Brahmin in one sense, and a master yogi, and was well respected by swamis and yoga people and priests all over India. So I had, he would sit out on his porch, and I would come to my class, and I remember the first time I was afraid to walk up the stairs to sit next to him, sincerely, I was 19. But he recognized me. He said things to me. Like, one of the important messages he said to me is that, I don't know if you've been a student of Patanjali, but Viveka is discernment, or what we used to say discrimination. We changed that word to discernment just in the politically correct world, but distinguishing between the real and the unreal, etc. And Patanjali considers Viveka Khyati, that dawning of discernment or discriminative awareness, is a sign of, awakening. And he uses the phrase Purusha. So Viveka Khyati, and he uses the word Purusha Khyati, which is like self-realization. And then Krishnamacharya said to me that Viveka Khyati and Purusha Khyati and Ishvara Khyati, that is God realization, are all the same. So things like that. He would just make comments to me. Sometimes he would be talking, like Desikachar used to invite me to some small classes. I don't mean small classes, private sessions he was having with his father. Small means it only happened 3 or 4 times, where Krishnamacharya was teaching Desikachar, and suddenly he would look up at me and say, "Did you understand?" And of course, it was all in a mixture of Sanskrit, probably Telugu or Malayalam, I think maybe, but I forget now, and English. And of course, the answer was no. I didn't really fully understand. But then he's like, "Give me a banana and say, eat it," just like that. I was young. And he recognized me. He made the decision to say that thing about Ishvara Khyati to me, that God realization, self-realization. When you awaken to seeing things as clearly as they are, you have self-realization and God realization is this one and the same. So he understood that I was different in a way than a lot of Desikachar's other students who were also business people or engineering students, biomechanical engineering. I was a religious studies guy, and he seemed to recognize that.
Huh. So he's speaking to you directly, particularly with that comment, you think?
Yeah, definitely. And you know, there are other things that he taught, like he said, running's for horses.
Yeah, I remember you saying that in another podcast.
Things like that. And, you know, Desikachar would tell me stories about him, you know, and he was extraordinary. As far as the relationships in the family, it's hard to know from the outside. He was revered and respected, but I don't know that it was like a modern relationship. His wife was much younger than him.
Yes.
His wife was Iyengar's much older sister.
Yeah.
But she was much younger than Krishnamacharya. But I remember her. She died long before he did, actually, even though she was much younger. And I just remember feeling honored to be able. My classes were in the house where Krishnamacharya and his wife lived, and Desikachar was living there.
That's just
nuts. And Desikachar was. You asked about Desikachar. He was more or less or completely fluent in English, and I'm an American, so I speak American English, right? He was pretty fluent in American English, but he grew up, was raised by his father. So there are some cultural things that I as a young man, didn't know, you know, that he basically was probably offended by things that I did, but was very kind about it because he just knew I didn't understand their culture. It took me some years to really learn how to, as a young American, to adapt to and understand, because he was so open and friendly. So it took me a while to understand. But he was raised by this very, Orthodox Brahmin. But his family, they wanted him to become educated in Western science, so he became an engineer. I think it was a construction engineer. But then when he was in his early 20s, right after he graduated, he ended up working for 1 year and then abandoned it and became a student of his father. He was a student of his father all his life, but he became a full-time yoga professional and took up his father's mantle.
Did you see him as a capacity of a son? Was he also a son, or was it right?
He was Desikachar's son. I mean, he was Krishnamacharya's son.
Indeed.
He's his middle son. He had 3 sons.
Yeah. The relationship-wise, did you ever see him acting as a son, or was it very much like your father as a very kind of almost like a kind of Victorian father who was never really kind of parental in the normal sense that we now in the modern sense of parental, more just kind of like,
honestly, it would be hard for me to judge. Yeah, of course, he treated him with great reverence and respect. He called him father, but he was like his guru or teacher. But he was so close that I think it was probably mixed.
Yeah.
But I think that his father, I don't really know, because I was young but I think that his father was very strict, very orthodox in his own way of yoga and his Vishishtadvaitin Sampradaya, his lineage.
Yeah.
And he didn't compromise about that. And so, he related to Desikachar as a student and I'm sure as a son. I don't really know that. I can't really say. I had an opportunity to have a meal or two with the whole family.
Wow.
More often after he was gone with Desikachar and his wife and his kids. But a couple of times with the father. And I was in awe. I was young.
Don't make sure you don't eat with your left hand. You'll be kicked out.
Yeah. By then I had learned a little bit of protocol.
Yes, obviously you would have learned that pretty early on. What about Desikachar? He was your main teacher, obviously, and you had a strong and a long-lasting relationship with Desikachar.
30 years,
I was only intrigued about, what kind of a teacher he was, because you did mention that he was still quite rigorous in some manners, and I always assumed, as I said before, he was a rather kind of soft and mild-mannered kind of guy.
Yeah, I was very open and honest with him. I didn't hide anything, and he was very accepting of who I was, but also he could be very intense. He had a lot of fire. And when I was younger, I was assuming that if he was being intense with me, he was trying to teach me something. I know that some of his students left because they couldn't handle the heat. I have a Spanish friend who never left. But he used to say in his Spanish English, caramella boom, to describe Desikachar. Caramel is a candy, and then boom is a whack. That's how he used to describe him, caramella boom. And, I was one of the early Western students. There are older guys that are some still alive, like François Laurent and Claude Maréchal, who were there. Over all these years, as we matured, we saw other aspects of Desikachar. But what I can say is that he was brilliant. He was like a genius. Like I became close with some of one other student of Krishnamacharya's, S. Ramaswamy, for a while. They were very different. Ramaswamy was much more the letter of everything Krishnamacharya said. Desikachar took his father's teachings and then adapted them and brought his engineering science, his understanding of Western science, and his understanding of Western culture. So a lot of the creativity that we have in our practice is from the brilliance of Desikachar. The teachings are Krishnamacharya's. There's no doubt it's not Desikachar made up anything. But he adapted it and made it practical and relevant. And of course, that's the hallmark of Krishnamacharya's teachings and why he called it Viniyoga. That is, the practices are not about the practices. They're about the practitioner. It's not about mastering asana. It's about using asana to understand and transform your body. It's not about mastering pranayama or meditation. They're all tools to help you transform your own condition at a multidimensional level and actualize your highest potential. And so Desikachar and Krishnamacharya both were very pragmatic in that sense, in making these practices relevant for practitioners. And Krishnamacharya said that better a half a life lived in following Svadharma than a whole life following somebody else's Paradharma. And I know that Desikachar, when he was a young man, J. Krishnamurti, the famous teacher, came to see Krishnamacharya, and Krishnamacharya had him study with Desikachar. And Desikachar, very long ago, gave me a little teeny book called Freedom from the Known with Krishnamurti's signature. He gave that book to Desikachar, and Desikachar gave that book to me. And what he told me that he learned from Krishnamurti is, and this is a quote, "Don't be another monkey. Don't follow people. Stand on your own feet." So Desikachar was at that time, was before he developed the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram. He was very concerned with training his students to think on their own and to understand the principles and then adapt and apply them creatively in the context of the people that they're working with. He said, "You are teaching in the West. I'm from India, right? So I need you to understand this work and then creatively adapt it to make it relevant for your clientele." And that's in integrity with the way Krishnamacharya taught.
What do they? I mean, it's kind of ironic then that Krishnamacharya is obviously the so-called founder of Ashtanga Yoga, the Ashtanga Yoga dynamic system of Patabi Joyce. I mean, did they ever speak about that? The last question on this kind of front. What do they say about that? Yeah,
I want to I'll share it in an open
please do,
in an unfiltered way.
Yeah.
What happened for me is that in 1976, I met David Williams, who we became very friendly. And I didn't know anything about Patabi Joyce or Ashtanga Yoga. I'd already been 6 months in Madras, and I graduated college and moved to Maui in the summer of 1976. And in a couple of months later, I went to Madras for 2 years. But I'd already been there. But I met David. So when I got there, and then I remember that I went to David's wife, who now has passed, long ago, Nancy Gilgoff, and now she's passed, I understand. And she was teaching in haiku in upcountry Maui, where I was living, where my parents had actually had a house where they were living there. And so I went to Nancy's class, and I did a series 1 in the first week, series 2 the second week. I was a gymnast in high school. I'd already been in Madras, so then I did most of series 3 in the third week. And I said, okay, I get it. And then I went back to India. So I wanted to ask Desikachar about that. Because I had heard some story about palm leaves and all of that.
Yeah.
And Desikachar just went like this. And this is how he talked. He didn't talk. He did this mudra. Oh, you can't see my hand. Let's see. Like that. It was like this dismissal.
Yeah.
And then I said, no, but what is it? He said, you know, Father put together pashers in a series to train young people, mostly Brahmin boys, at the palace in Mysore, of which Pattabhi Jois was one. And so he said, do you want to learn all that stuff? And I said, I don't know. He said, well, let's go through, this is a quote, let's go through the hell, and then we'll come to something real. That's exactly what he said. And then he wouldn't address it much. One year, because of me talking with David and one of David's students who was an investment guy, anyway, had money, and hearing about Krishnamacharya, they brought Pattabhi Jois to Madras. He hadn't seen Krishnamacharya in 50 years.
Okay.
And evidently, I wasn't there, but what they said is that Krishnamacharya came out, Pattabhi Jois pranam to his feet, and then Krishnamacharya went back in, and that was the end of it. So I don't know anything about their relationship. I know that in the palace, the Mysore Maharaj Palace, where Pattabhi Jois was teaching for Krishnamacharya, he was an older student, and he was training, he was teaching for Krishnamacharya, so they had a relationship. He was trained as a pundit, and his lineage was the Shaivite lineage, and Krishnamacharya is the Vaishnavite lineage. That's another thing Krishnamacharya said to me. These are God's feet. So every day he paints God's feet, which is a sign of his surrender, dedication, his life at the feet of God. Anyway, so they were from a slightly different lineage. But, Krishnamacharya, he insisted on teaching all classes, all different, the scheduled classes. He would teach them. He would teach chanting and Vedic chanting to women, Indians, and even even worse, to white people. Like, I was trained deeply in Vedic chanting. There's a master in our lineage of Vedic chanting. It's not me, it's Sonia Nelson. She's extraordinary. But I studied Vedic chanting from the early 1970s.
Yeah.
So he taught things. He broke the rules of the tradition. And there's a precedent for that, even in his lineage. Ramanujacharya climbed to the temple steps and shouted out the secret mantra, in front of everybody. So there's that precedent of really making the practice real and relevant for whomever is able to take it and receive it and engage in the practice. And I love that about them. They were not dogmatic at all. And they were very real. There was clear information, no drama. Well, minor drama. There was no scandals about money or sex with either of those guys at all. Nothing like that. Maybe if there's a drama, that there was a little bit of extra strictness and harshness, but that's sort of that methodology, that caramelabum, I know I got a lot stronger because of it. It was painful. I have to admit that sometimes it was painful for me, but I persisted, and I received so much. My whole life has been grounded in these teachings, and it's shaped my whole life. So I honor, love, respect, revere them and the tradition that they represent. They are not the tradition. They don't own the tradition. The tradition's living, and we can all have access to it. So I'm not one of those sheep or something. Yeah, but I have great respect and gratitude for what I've received from them.
I've got I've got many questions actually on this, but two first questions is, well, where did they say then? Did Desikachar speak about the tradition of his father? So where did where's the precedent in the lineage? Because if you look at Yoga Makaranda, it's kind of, almost a synergy of Patanjali sutras, but then there's some tantric stuff in there, and then there's yoga therapy. It's hard to get a hold of exactly what Krishnamacharya thought, or did he think of, and same with your book in a way. It's like at a certain point you'll speak about energy, but at another point you're very mechanical, speaking about treating illnesses, for example, so I think the second question kind of follows on from this. Let's speak a little bit about defining Viniyoga for our audience.
Let me begin with the first comment. This is what I know historically, that Krishnamacharya's father was his first teacher. He was an Orthodox Brahmin. And, but he would wake Krishnamacharya up at 3 a.m. by pouring water in his ear. Some awful stories, right? by modern standards anyway. And so he was a student of his father, and he was in the Vishishtadvaitin lineage, and he was being kind of groomed to be the Parakala Swami, which is like the Shankaracharya in his Vishishtadvaitin lineage. And but then his father died when he was young. And so as a young man, he traveled from Mysore all the way up to Benares, and he met, and he ended up getting many degrees, like PhDs, like Pandit, many times over. And one of his great teachers was a sage, a great scholar of the time called Ganganathan Jha, who's an interesting, I have some of his books. And anyway, that's a different, I can get distracted on that story. And then while he was there, he was already a yoga practitioner. And what they told me is that there was a British viceroy, this was at the time of the Raj, the British, controlling India, who had diabetes. And evidently Krishnamacharya helped him with some practice. He was not only a yoga master, but he knew Ayurveda, he knew Jyotish, Vedic astrology. He knew a lot. He knew Buddhism. He knew a lot of things. In fact, he could even, they say, pick a racehorse, which is, if we get to it, that's another story I'll tell you. But anyway, so he was a brilliant man, and the British viceroy got him a pass. He wanted to go to Kailash, Mount Kailash in Tibet, and it was closed. And the British viceroy got him a pass. So he went up, and there he met who is said to be his guru, Ramana Mohan Brahmachari. Ramana Mohan Brahmachari was said to be, and I only know this hearsay, I'm just sharing what I learned. Ramana Mohan Brahmachari was said to be a South Indian yogi living in the cave up in around Mount Kailash,
Oh, he's a South Indian yogi.
At Manasarovar, the lake of the mind, the Manasarovar, which is in the base of Mount Kailash. So he lived for 7 years in that cave. And he had already learned the Viniyoga idea from his family lineage. And there's a whole story about the Yoga Rahasya. That's a different discussion. The text by Nathamuni, which is where the word Viniyoga is first used Patanjali uses it before that, but in the 3rd chapter, Tasya Bhumishu Viniyogaha. But the Yoga Rahasya describes Viniyoga in the context of practice. So we already had that teaching, but then he lived in 7 years up in Tibet at 14,000 feet, right? So cold. And that's where he learned this idea of what I learned is that's where the jump throughs came from. That you guys use in Ashtanga. Yeah. That it came from Tibet. And so I think you're right that Krishnamacharya's teachings were a synthesis of his Vishishtadvaita Sampradaya, the lineage of his ancestors, which go back to Yamunacharya, and Nathamuni, and Ramanujacharya, Nathamuni, Yamunacharya. That's that Sampradaya, that the Vishishtadvaitin Sampradaya. And his family, Ishta, was Hayagriva. I don't know if you even know what I'm talking about. It's a different, I don't want to take time for that.
The last part I don't know, but I know the lineage Sampradaya.
It's an incarnation of Vishnu with like a horse. And he goes under the sea and recovers the Vedas, and there's whole stories about it. But then he learned things from his teacher in Tibet, his Indian yoga master in Tibet. And the master said to him, for Guru Dakshina, after 7 years in a cave, what was his payment is to go back into the world and have a family. Like he disappeared into the cave. It wasn't after he had a family, in the Vanaprastha stage of life. He did it before he became a householder. And his guru told him to go back into the world, have a family, and teach yoga. So that's what he did. And he went back down to Madras or Mysore. And then later, I think a famous British or Indian advocate, lawyer, suggested that he move from Mysore to Madras. And Desikachar was born in Mysore, but they moved to Madras. And that's where, the rest is history.
The story is very similar in the Ashtanga lineage, the Rama Mohan Brahmachari and this kind of thing, except the sage is generally speaking to in Gurkha language, which he's also fluent in. What do you think? Do you think that obviously that story must have been taught to you by or told to you by Desikachar?
Correct.
So
correct. So I don't know anything other than what he told me.
Yes, exactly. Well, leaving that aside and the veracity of it, which is a whole other subject, would you like to explain a little bit about the Viniyoga elements now?
Sure.
because we have this idea in Ashtanga about vinyasa. It's very important. Pattabhi later quotes a particular verse, "Oh, yogi, don't do yoga without vinyasa," right? But really, I mean, before Krishnamacharya, we don't see anyone doing any connective breath-centered movements. It seems in texts anyway.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, they're two separate words. They're completely unrelated words.
Okay,
Viniyoga is the word yoga,
right.
the Sanskrit root yuj, which means to connect or to join, plus the verbal prefix vi. So vi and the verbal prefix ni. So v plus ni plus yoga, that's Viniyoga. Vinyasa is the word nyasa. Nyasa means placement. Like nyasa, when you're doing meditation on a yantra, you're placing the meaning of the yantra. If you're doing Om Bhuhu, let's see if you can see me. Om Bhuhu Tatsat Vitorvarenyam. Om Bhuvaha Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Ogum Su. You can't see me. Ogum Suvaha Diyo Yona Prachodayate. Those are nyasas. And that nyasa, if you know anything about the Catholic Church, they go like this, and then like this, and then like that. That's a nyasa. So nyasa means place or placement. Vinyasa in asana is vinyasa doesn't just mean asana order. It means the placement of things in a sequence. So vinyasa at the level of asana practice is the sequence with which you put things together. It doesn't mean flow. That's maybe a misunderstanding that maybe started in America, in Southern California. But of course, the Surya Namaskaram, which isn't about exercise, it's part of Hindu ritual, like worshiping the sun at sunrise, but that's a vinyasa in the sense of flow. And Ashtanga is a vinyasa. You're flowing from one posture to the next through this jump-through process, which I learned it as the vinyasa for Paschimottanasana. That's the way they taught that to me. And then you go to the next posture, and then you go to the next posture, and you use that jump-through. And the theory was you warm your body up through that. You know, Krishnamacharya in his early years of teaching, when he taught Pattabhi Jois, this is what I was taught. I'm making no claim. I'm sharing sharing what I was taught. It makes sense to me. So in that early couple of decades when Pattabhi Jois was trained, Krishnamacharya used those to warm, because he was teaching principally young Brahmin boys, not only boys, and not only Brahmin, but mostly. That's where his students. So he was doing these jump throughs to develop heat. But then by paying attention, he realized the heat isn't enough to work with people. In fact, that's how I began my career. If you want to know a story that's true, and I don't mean it in any other way than just sharing the truth, I began my career as a yoga teacher on Maui, and my original students were refugees from Ashtanga yoga and from hula dancing who had joint injuries. Hula, that's because the way that they trained, just like Pattabhi Jois, the way that they trained in the halaus, training hula dance, it was a martial art. So they trained kids from a young age in the hula. And a lot of 30, 40, 50-year-old white women from America would come there and learn, and they would get hip, knee, sacrum, ankle injuries from the hula dancing, and the Ashtanga yogis who had shoulder problems, hip problems, knee problems. Those were my original clients. So what Krishnamacharya saw was that heat isn't enough to transform the body. And so he developed this whole science of adapting the form of the posture to access the body in a particular way. So the science of adaptation is so that you can transform your body, not so you can master the postures, but so that you can transform your body, as evidenced by your ability to master the postures. An ability to master a posture shows that you've transformed your body. That's not the goal. The goal is to have stability, free range of motion, muscular symmetry, and to develop functional movement patterns. That's the anatomical goals of asana. There's more to it than that.
Yeah.
So that whole idea of Viniyoga is okay. The postures are not about the postures. They're about the practitioner. Viniyoga means to adapt the postures to suit the needs of the practitioner and then apply them appropriately. So differentiate the person you're working with, or differentiate your own body condition, adapt the postures and apply them appropriately. That's Viniyoga. That's the meaning of Viniyoga in the context of asana practice. And, we can use flows or not, but we always practice asana in a sequence. And that's the true sense of the word vinyasa. It means there's an order with which you place, nyasa place, the order with which you place the postures. And that should be intelligent and respect anatomical principles. That's what Desikachar brought. He brought all the biomechanics to it.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, this is actually my father's teaching, makes a lot of sense, and here's why.
So to ask a silly question, did you ever do any of the jumping then? Did they ever teach you any of that?
Oh, yeah, when I was a kid. You know what Desikachar said about Ashtanga? Kid stuff. And I was a young man when I went there, so I was able to do handstand. And I remember some of now senior people in Madras, they remember that I was older than them. They remember me showing them how to go from handstand into Urdhva Dhanurasana. I'd never done it before. Desikachar had me do it in front of all these little kids in India. That's what he meant by kid stuff. It's tricks. But it's not what you need, you know, for example, at my advanced age, right? You know, you don't need it. Once you're over 30, you want to protect your joints. The problem with Ashtanga for many people is it's about the postures and the sequence, and you end up getting joint injuries. And I told you, that's how I literally made my living. Honestly, I bought land and built a house on Maui from income earned from injured Ashtanga yogis, hula teachers, hula dancers, also ballet dancers and stuff. I used to get all these people that had injuries. And that's how I made my living.
That's a good story. You should put that as a quote. I built a house on on the injuries of Ashtanga yoga. That's kind of funny.
Not just Ashtanga. So, I mean, but not just Ashtanga.
Yeah, no, but it makes you know, it's funny to Ashtanga people if you said that. But well, maybe not.
Well, anybody who's practiced Ashtanga for 20 years knows.
Yes.
They know. You know from your own experience. Some of it's great. You get strong, but you can reinforce dysfunctional movement patterns and create joint injuries.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many other things, but I recognize we're slightly, I try to keep it short, like an hour. Maybe we'll do another one when you have time again, Gary. So I'm just going to ask you a few questions. I mean, reading through one of your books, and I mean, great stuff on anatomy, great stuff on, you know, just on yoga generally for any practitioner. I mean, at one point you say, asana is a practice and study of movement potential, not in the attainment of perfect form. And you use that a lot, the kind of potential of movement, getting out a certain kind of quality of movement out of someone. But I always think when I was reading the book, how does that dovetail into to kind of the higher aims of yoga? You know, if we're obviously
that's a great question. And I asked my teacher, you know, because I was a religious studies student, so I didn't come to yoga because of asana. And I was a gymnast, so I had the illusion I was wrong that I already understood that, and I didn't. Obviously, I learned a lot, but I was really interested in what does Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward dog, have to do with Kaivalya? I asked Desikachar directly. You know, what does it have to do with Paravairagya? You know, non-attachment, the true deeper meaning and goals of yoga. And he said that what happens with asana practice, besides training the mind to focus, is we build the prana shakti, the energy that we need to overcome our dysfunctional patterns. The teaching is really that one of the main practical purposes of yoga is to surface our samskaras at the body level. It could be dysfunctional movement patterns, which you can do Ashtanga and reinforce your dysfunctional movement patterns. You know, I used to joke with people, forgive me if I say a bad word, if you're an asshole and you go to a meditation class the way mostly it's taught, you become a very focused asshole, right? So you can reinforce your dysfunction. So the purpose of this practice is to build the energy and the focus that you need to begin to surface your patterns and then have the energy to transform them. But if you just do asana, and that's all you do, the chances of you really, like I remember in the old days, people used to say it's all an asana. And I said, that just means you haven't been trained. Yoga is so much more than asana. Asana is an important part, but it's a small part of a much deeper process of transformation so that we can eliminate causes of suffering and actualize our innate potential. And what Desikachar told me when I was in my early 20s is the real purpose of yoga is preparation for the moment of death. And that's a longer story, what he meant by that. But you know, as you get older, like I'm like I said, I'll be 70 in a couple of months, and I don't have any pain in my body. And so asana has served me, and I have range of motion. But you know, doesn't mean I'm not going to die. And so, how's asana going to help me at the end of my life? It's really not the asana, but asana is a part of this process, of this integrated science of asana, pranayama, chanting, meditation, and these specialized tantric practices, so that we reach the end of life with a sense of of accomplishment, of meaning and purpose, of joy rather than resentment, and maybe curiosity rather than fear about what's next. He told me that what you should be doing at your age, and that was when I was in my 20s, is thinking about your next birth.
Well, that's the classical interpretation of yoga, isn't it? It's like, preparing for a rebirth, which is kind of, again, ironic because people are definitely not using it generally for that these days.
No.
Well, what about this repetition then? Because you mentioned repetition, and obviously, you know, we're ostensibly an Ashtanga podcast.
Has everything to do with
I invite way too many guests on that kind of generally trash Ashtanga. You know, and you mentioned good things about repetition and also bad things. When you say repetition helps us recognize habitual movement patterns and to develop new ones. So when might you speak about the positive aspects of repetition, and when maybe we should avoid doing, you know, because obviously it can ingrain patterns as much as it can help us recognize patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. So nobody really taught you and I formally how to walk. It was by imitation and repetition. If you hear my English and I listen to your English, you know, well, we didn't grow up in the same place. I lived in Hawaii for 30 years, but somebody who's from the East Coast of the United States can tell that I grew up in Philadelphia. And that's from, you know, so imitation and repetition is how we learn to speak, how we learn to walk. And so we have movement patterns, neuromuscular movement patterns that condition the way we move. And then less we're critically self-conscious of our movement patterns, all of our movement reinforces them. So you can do great Ashtanga yoga, but you can reinforce dysfunctional movement patterns, or any kind of movement, dance, or any kind of movement, any kind of physical activity. Your movements will follow pre-established patterns. So there's a great role in neuromuscular reeducation. If you're moving consciously, you can transform a movement pattern. So repetition is good for transforming dysfunctional movement patterns if you bring your conscious awareness to it and change the way you're doing it. And if you don't, you're going to just reinforce the patterns. And then repetition has other benefits. So if I go bend forward, like stay a standing forward bend like Uttanasana, my erector spine and long muscles of my back are stretched. When I come back, they're contracted. You know, now we understand in exercise physiology what Krishnamacharya explained, pratikriya, that idea of moving in opposition. It creates you know, you alternate, contract a muscle and release it, and that's how the muscle gets looser. If you just stretch it afterwards, it'll get tighter, right? So if you just contract it, so you need that alternating stretching and contracting to recondition the muscle, to increase the flow of blood, to increase the flow of prana shakti, so that the muscle becomes healthy. We use the word resilient. You develop a healthy muscle. So it reconditions the muscles and it transforms the movement patterns. And that's the benefit of repetition. But you don't want to do too much of it because you can put stress to the joints, especially if you have structural asymmetry or if you have not transformed those movement patterns. So the big risk the most common risk in any physical activity is to the joints, you know, to the ligament tissue. And so we want to understand joint protection. The asanas are tools to help us, you know, create more structural stability, more resilience in the muscles, more symmetry and more alignment, all of those good things.
And it's pratikriya, the posture, counter posture. That's right, isn't it? I always forget that one. Well, I mean, one thing I noticed when I read the Makaranda, when I was looking at the Makaranda, the sequences at the back, is that they're very much based on posture, counter posture. And I think that's something that is generally, there's traces of it there in the Ashtanga sequence, but it's not there to the degree that one might like, really, you know.
You can take more with kids have more resilience. You can have a 5-year-old running and fall on their face and get up and laugh and run some more. But if that happened to me, it would be not so funny, right? So the kids have more resilience and you can take more risks with them. And what Krishnamacharya was doing was helping them put together a lot of postures to help their bodies. It was called Shrishti Krama, to help their bodies grow in a balanced way. So this is Nathamuni's teaching, Shrishti Krama and Shakti Krama, to cultivate power. That was the age period for the Ashtangis. It was for the original idea of Ashtanga Yoga to support the balanced growth and development of the body and to cultivate, that's Shrishti, and then to cultivate as much power, that's Shakti. And the method was Stiti, do it the way the teacher says. But for adults, it was first and foremost Rakshana Krama, that means protect the joints, protect the body, and then Stiti Krama, create stability. So for the kids, Srishti Shakti. For the adults, Rakshana and Sthiti, protection and stability. And then for seniors, Adhyatmika, Laya, and Antya. Adhyatmika is self-realization. Laya or Antya means complete what needs to be completed, the end game. And then Alaya, getting ready to merge back with source. So this is Natha Muni's teachings about Viniyoga, that at sunrise stage of life, that was Ashtanga. A sunrise stage practice, midday stage of life, that's kind of Viniyoga, and then sunset stage of life, Viniyoga goes there as well. So at the first 30, say, years of life, more emphasis on asana. Krishnamacharya said, Natha Muni said, in the midday stage of life, it's more pranayama than asana. Because pranayama helps you regulate sympathetic, parasympathetic function and optimize physiological functioning. We use asana in the service of pranayama. And for senior sunset stage of life, more meditation prayer. Classic traditional idea. So Ashtanga is not meant to be a practice for a 6-year-old. This wasn't.
That is patently clear from what you're saying. I mean, and it's fascinating stuff, and I'm pleased, I have to say, for good or for bad, I'm pleased you're saying it. Nevertheless, we look at Krishnamacharya as an older man, and, he's certainly doing something, whether he's lifting weights or doing asanas. He's in pretty good shape, let's put it that way. So he must be still doing asana, breaking his own rules.
Oh,
and
of
doing
course.
pretty,
it's not that we don't
heavy asana.
Yeah, it's not that we don't do, I do a lot of asana. It's not that we don't do asana, but we use it in a different context.
Yeah.
Like an integrated practice. I can do asana like for my back or my neck, and go for a walk. Or I can do asana to prepare for pranayama, and I can do pranayama to help me sleep better or have more energy. I can do asana and pranayama to prepare for meditation. And that's mostly my practice, asana, pranayama, chanting to prepare for deep meditation at my stage of life and my interests. These guys are there because since COVID, like I teach a lot like we're doing now online. Now that's changing again, but they're there to remind me that this isn't about me. This is something that flows through me. And these are symbols. Asanas are also symbols. And these deities are symbols. If you understand that it's not about the deities, it's not about the asana, they're tools to help us understand and transform ourselves. And this whole idea of Devata yoga, very few people know Krishnamacharya's teachings about that. But that's the deeper teachings of yoga.
Just an abrupt change of course, I suppose, but I wanted to get back to a couple of practical things that I think will, help any listener in their practices. You talk of a great term. I think it's a fantastic. Maybe it's yours, maybe it's Desikachar's, because it's quite mechanical. Release valves. The idea of release valves in yoga, and I think that's a great way to say it, really, because there's a lot of people are stretching, and obviously they're stretching they're naturally stretchy, let's say, and as we're finding in yoga now, that they're overstretching. Essentially, they're stretching into areas of instability, of hypermobility, and you talk about release valves as the compensatory mechanisms that occur when we can't stabilize a part of the body. Would you like to just elaborate briefly on this idea?
Thank you for asking. That's a very important idea. It's not my idea. It came from Desikachar.
Okay. That's an excellent term.
We would call avoidance mechanisms. Maybe I think release valve was Desikachar's phrase. I would sometimes, release valve or avoidance mechanism. The body finds the lines of least resistance. If you have a tight low back and hypermobile ilioischial pubofemoral ligaments, your pelvic ligaments are long, then when you move, there's all this rotation of the pelvis around the transverse axis of the hips, and you don't stretch your back. So the point is that when we're doing something in our body, a movement in any direction in our body, there's something happening that's useful, but there may be some avoidance things going on. Your body finds the easiest way to do it. So people who are hypermobile, they need to block the range of motion in their joints in order to effectively stretch their muscles, right? People who have very tight muscles, you need to support the range of motion in their joints. So you can bend the knees or elevate the sit bones if they're sitting on the floor. That will help the pelvis rotate forward if their ligaments are shortened so they can effectively stretch their back. Whereas you're hypermobile, you need to bend the knees to block the forward rotation of the pelvis. So release valve is how the body avoids the functional benefit of an exercise by deferring it to an area that's more free. And that's the basic concept. And when you're watching, when we train teachers and therapists, we train them to read the body, to observe their students' bodies and what's actually happening in their bodies, to identify, are they, when they're doing a movement, are they actually getting a functional benefit? Or what are the release valves that they're avoiding that benefit through? And then how do we learn to block the release valve so they can actually get the functional benefit of the posture? Posture is not about its form. It's about its functional potential in the human body. And our bodies are different, so the way it should look for any individual might be different so that that functional benefit can be achieved.
I mean, it's in simple term, but not easy to understand, because I think usually when people get fixated, especially in forms that are visually based, like a yenga or ashtanga, to do the shape in the correct or perfect manner, then obviously pushing into natural areas of flexibility in order to achieve the said shape is the obvious thing, and actually pushing into those areas of flexibility is the very release valve thing that you're talking about in the first place.
Yeah. Krishnamacharya, what I heard is that like texts like Hatha Yoga Pradipika, remember, yoga is an oral tradition. Originally was an oral tradition. So the later Hatha Yoga texts that put together more descriptions of asana, they were in they weren't sutras, but they were like shlokas. So they were very short, not complete grammatical sentences. So, head to knee, that's Paschimottanasana. But that doesn't mean you should put your head on your knee. It was an oral tradition. So that was a reference for the teachers, right? But then they would transmit to that individual student how to actualize Paschimottanasana for your own body, which may be different than the person next to you. And that's the way I was taught. It's a misunderstanding to think each asana has a correct form, and the role of the practitioner is to master the form of the posture. What Krishnamacharya said is, actually, don't contort. This is a rough quote. Don't contort your body to match the form of the posture. Adapt the form of the posture to suit the needs of your body. Adapt the form of posture to suit the needs of your body. And it's just a misunderstanding. And it's a misunderstanding. Here's another one from him. It's a misunderstanding to think that the role of a teacher is to teach the students to do the postures correctly. Just think about all the teacher training programs in the world. That's what they think their job is. Krishnamacharya said, no, misunderstanding. It's not the role of a teacher to teach the students to do the postures correctly. It's the role of the teachers to teach the student how to use the posture to understand the needs of their own body, and then how to adapt the posture so they can get that functional need met. It's not about the posture, it's about the practitioner. The teacher's job is to awaken in the practitioner an understanding of how to use the postures to effectively come to a deeper to deepen their understanding of their own body and effectively transform it. That's what postures are for. They're not about the postures. And this is Krishnamacharya, like that. This pure Krishnamacharya teaching.
What about this quote then? It's through the breath that we can truly link the mind to the body. People often think, and that drives me mad actually, just do the posture and then breathe. But actually what you suggest in the book is exactly what I found out myself, that the breathing is actually the movement itself, and not in a poetic manner, that out of the very breath comes the spinal movement. And you spoke exactly my thoughts in your book. So I'd like you to just elaborate slightly on that if you would.
I mean, this is, for us, it's day one. Day one, first lesson is the relationship between the flow of breath and the movement of the spine. And the asanas done on inhale are an extension of the effect of inhale on the spine. The asanas done on exhale are an extension of the effect of exhale. And there's more detail than that. But the asana, the shape of the asana emerges from within through the breath. So what we're doing is learning the biomechanical principles for controlling inhale and exhale. There's a lot of confusion in the yoga world about what we call directional flow. Do you inhale in your belly and then your chest, or chest to belly? Krishnamacharya Desikachar's response was, again, this mudra, this dismissing. There's not a right or wrong way. They all have different effects and different purposes. There's a more or less relevant way for any individual. But the default in Viniyoga is that asanas are breath-centric. Breath-centric asana is my expression. Iyengar yoga is form-centric asana, right? Ashtanga yoga is sequence-centric. It's this, but Krishnamacharya's teaching is breath-centric. So the starting point is to feel the breath move the spine, and then your movement extends that effect. So what happens on inhale? What happens on inhale? Let's talk just do you have a little time to talk a minute or two about this? Are we still good?
Yeah, we're still good, yeah.
Like, is inhale belly or chest? there's not a right or wrong, but what actually happens when you inhale? Where does the air go? It comes from outside, it comes into your nose, and it goes down and fills your lungs. How does it do it? The diaphragm contracts. What happens to the diaphragm when it contracts? It goes down. So the ancients knew inhale's a downward movement. In Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna that chapter 4, I forget the shloka, inhales where prana is offered to apana. If you study, the esoteric anatomy, and this prana apana is in Taittiriya Upanishad, prana is head and chest and down, apana is below the navel. So inhale is a downward movement. It's fine to make inhale an upward movement. It's not wrong, but classically inhale is a downward movement. So if you expand your chest when you inhale, what happens? The ribs expand horizontally. What happens to the intervertebral bodies extend? You create intervertebral space through the inhale. You create more space, intervertebral space. So inhale is that downward movement. Exhale is an upward movement. With exhale, you're offering apana to prana. That's Krishna's teaching to Arjuna in the 4th chapter of Gita. What's happening is the diaphragm's coming up and the air is going up and out. So what happens in exhale is you have the ability to control the pelvic lumbar relationship. By tightening the belly below the navel, you can control the pelvic lumbar relationship, create stability in your low back. With inhale, you can influence the thoracolumbar relationship. You can lift your sternum up and away from your navel and lengthen your spine. So combined together, inhale and exhale, if you're listening to your breath, you can attune to and actually intentionally create intervertebral movement. I had a lot of chiropractor students in the years gone by when I was living on Maui, and they used to send me referrals for work compensation. That was part of my career back then. And they would you can't do that. Yes, I can. I was showing them I can isolate and move individual vertebral bodies, one off the other, just because of the decades of working with the breath, or isolate and stretch my psoas. A lot of those back then, they said, no, that's not possible. Of course, it's all possible. That's through the breath. So the movement emerges from the breath is the way we teach it, breath-centric asana. And the focus is more on the relationship between the flow of breath and the movement of the spine than it is on the form of the posture.
Form
follows function. That was, Desikachar asked me to write something about that. And we're talking about in the late 1970s. I wrote an article for him called Form Follows Function. And the breath is how you tune in.
No, it was the fact that people are very obsessed now. The exact vinyasa, for example, so-and-so Paschimottanasana, 18 vinyasa, right? And Krishnamacharya does seem to have some interest in his books about the number of vinyasa, but it's simply for that case, right? That it's not a magical number in the vinyasa. It's simply inhale, exhale, creating a particular movement of the diaphragm and subsequently the spine.
He was organizing postures together to make it efficient for young people to expand their vocabulary of postures and expand their own, promote balanced growth and development, that's Shrishti Krama, and build maximum power, Shakti Krama. But it wasn't just physical power, it was also discipline, obedience, even. That's Shikshana Krama, mental focus, memory, training memory. So there was much more even to training kids than asana. They would have them do asana while they're memorizing and chanting shlokas from the Bhagavad Gita. And then after the practice, they would sit and he would give teachings about the meaning. So it was an integrated science. It wasn't a separate thing.
Where did he come up with the idea of Ashtanga Yoga? I mean, so he could at Yoga Kurunta, right? But he was very interested in the Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, right? So,
well, if you study Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali, it's yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyanam, and samadhi. It's not asana. It's, it's all of that. And so the context for practice is yama, niyama. And then asana prepares the breath for pranayama. Pranayama prepares the mind for meditation. Meditation prepares the heart for prayer. And that's the integrated science, put together poetically. That's me, by the way. I've said that before, but that's the, asana, yama, niyama bring you into the right headspace. Because like I said, if you're an asshole and you do this practice, you can become a very focused asshole and become more proficient at your dysfunction. So yama, niyama creates the right relationship. Asana prepares the breath for pranayama. Pranayama, this is a simplification, obviously. Pranayama, the mind for meditation. meditation, the heart for prayer. And to me, that was the teaching that I received in Madras from this lineage.
I mean, could probably always assume. I mean, my kind of unfocused musings then was assuming that those kids that he was training were also taught, the yoga philosophy as well. Because people say, "Oh, why do they only teach asana then? What is it that you have to know asana first?" Teach asana. Yeah, exactly.
What I heard about Ashtanga yoga and Pattabhi Jois, I don't know if it's true. I've only met him. I had a couple meals with Pattabhi Jois. I have a funny story with having a dinner with Pattabhi Jois on Maui. And I lived in India for a long time, so I could sort of speak kind of that broken Indian English. I said, "Sir, your students are telling all bandhas in all asana." And he yelled. He said, No. So many times I am telling, not like that. That's Pattabhi Jois. But what I heard, now I don't know if it's true, is that he never intended his teachings to be called Ashtanga Yoga. Ashtanga Yoga was the name of his school, his shala.
Yeah.
And it became called Ashtanga Yoga. But that series of asana is not Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga. That's like self-realization fellowship meditation is Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is not just their self-realization fellowship practice, nor is Ashtanga Yoga Pattabhi Jois' sequence.
I think in the early days, the students just called it the yoga, actually. And then latterly, it was some called Ashtanga yoga.
Perhaps.
Look, Gary, to keep people, I've got a whole other podcast with you, I reckon, at some later date when we can get you again. But to keep people wanting more, we'll stop it there for now. Any parting words? First of all, let's ask the obvious question: where can people find you? I mean, where can I find you? I mean, obviously, Gary's got loads of books. Read the books; they're really bloody good, and really are. Where can we find you for other online?
Our website is www.viniyoga, Viniyoga.com, and I've produced hundreds of hours of audio, video courses on different topics that are that you can find and access through our website, and digital e-courses on asana unlocked, pranayama unlocked, meditation unlocked. I've been for the past 2 years going through every sutra of the Yoga Sutras with all the grammar, but different than just an academic translation, which is academically rigorous, but living meditations for each sutra. And that's a huge project. Right now, I've completed first, second, third chapter, and we're 1/3 of the way through the fourth chapter. So these are all available digitally online. And lots of yoga therapy stuff, yoga therapy for structural problems, physiological conditions, and emotional and mental health as well. So Viniyoga.com is a good access point.
It seems like you've always had a strong work ethic. Let's put it that way.
I'm busy.
Yeah, no doubt. I was underemphasizing that. And certainly, I mean, loads and loads of stuff. Anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to just particularly stress on an end? I mean, I usually ask these silly questions about guilty pleasures.
I think the important thing to say to people is that this practice is for you. It's about you. It's for you. And find a teacher or a teaching that you can relate to that helps you understand how to use these tools for yourself. Like you brush your teeth every day, that you want to take care of yourself regularly. Classes are fun. They're great. And they're educational and they're social, but that's not a substitute for your own personal work. And, we're in this life until it ends. And you want to find sustainable yoga that can take you all the way through the end so that you reach the end of life with a sense of contentment, fulfillment, not resentment and fear, right? And curiosity. Find a practice that helps you where you are and helps you set a direction for your own future. Because it's going to end quicker than we all want it to end. And we never know when, right? We never know when. So really, there's no time to waste, Anyway, I sincerely encourage people to really use this practice, not in a mechanical way, but for themselves. And then have fun.
Fantastic. What an interview. What an interview. Oh, such a great interview. Thank you so much, Gary. We're going to put the links to Gary's website and etc. Other things that Gary might want to share in the show notes. So look at the show notes and you'll find everything there. It remains to be said, Gary, so thankful for you coming on and appreciate your time. And hopefully we'll do a part 2 at a later date when we can get Gary again. Thank you again, Gary.
It's really an honor and a pleasure to meet you. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So thanks. I'll be happy to see you again, sir. All the best to you and everyone.